And you're recording.
Says
Okay,
recording.
great. Super.
So if that disappears, we notice to yell.
It's recording now.
Yeah. Yeah, just so everybody knows, we are recording it. So if you don't want to be seen or heard, now's your chance to turn off your microphone or your camera. But just having a daughter who's an attorney, I always make sure we let people know these things.
Bill, I didn't know somebody was going to be watching this. I thought we were just talking among ourselves.
Yeah, well, hang on. I can make them all go away. No problem. Well, appreciate folks joining us. Like to try to pass some of our quarantine time here at home by turning to a happier place in time. And appreciate you joining us. For the folks that are new to this, I'm Bill Goddard, big World's Fair fan. Actually, it was interesting. We were talking earlier as we're getting going. I worked at Cape Kennedy for a while, and that led me over to work for Disney. So everything comes in a full circle. I'm joined today by Dr. Kenneth Carpenter, who's sitting in front of the Rocket Park signs there. And just a real brief introduction before Kenneth gives you some of his bio, which is absolutely fascinating. Kenneth and I are both World's Fair fans and Disney fans, and we had the opportunity to meet at a Disney D23 convention. And I think we set a world's record for how many miles you can walk inside a theme park that night. It was, Carol, and I think we 20-something thousand steps or whatever it was. But
yeah, and that was including all the dancing, remember? In front of the
So we've been able to get together a number of times, a number of places. And a number of years ago, Kenneth had invited me to give a talk at NASA in the Goddard Space Flight Center about NASA's connections in the World's Fair. And that's what this talk is based on and slightly expanded. So Kenneth, if you'd care to fill folks in.
Okay. Bill's hit the essentials, I think. I'll just mention that obviously I work for NASA now. Started out, got a PhD at Ohio State, and went to University of Colorado for a couple of years to do my research postdoc, and had an opportunity there to work on one of the original Hubble instruments, which was being built at Ball Aerospace. So I did that, and the next thing I knew, I'm out at Goddard in the fall of '85, still working for the University of Colorado, having just moved across the country and bought a house, and then we had the Challenger accident, and it's like, we just moved and buy a house, and now we don't have a job. But it turned out there was plenty of work to do, and we dove into it and got Hubble launched in 1990. So since then, I've been working in what's called the Operations Project Scientist for Hubble, which means I represent the interests of the science community to the project management. And I work on future projects and other things. I do a lot of outreach, which includes things like this, which is actually the most fun of the whole job, being able to talk to people who are just excited and interested about space in general. I did go to the 1964-65 World's Fair as a youngin', about 11, 12 years old with my parents. And it's an experience that stayed with me all these years. And then when the 50th anniversary came up, in 2014 and 2015, we had all these celebrations and things, which allowed me to get together with people like Bill and a lot of people that are on the screen here, Mitch and Stephanie. Yeah, there you go. Carol as well. And it's been a wonderful experience overall. And it's kind of fun to think that a fair that's 50 years old can still be forging new friendships all these years later. So I'll stop being sappy now and let Bill get to it.
It's really been fascinating to get to know Kenneth. We got a nice tour of Goddard, and I had dabbled in this stuff in the dark ages. I worked, I started doing it in '73. And of course, it was daunting for me. Everything I worked on is in a museum now. So Kenneth is there. Oh yeah, this is where we control the Hubble. This is where we do this, and this is. I mean, it was really great. The one thing I'm glad was that the centrifuge was down for repair, so Kenneth didn't give me a ride in that. That would be too much.
I really wanted to give him a ride on that because it had been just so much better than a Disney ride. I think just more authentic.
I loved all the photos on the walls that we saw of all the space stuff.
Oh yeah, the various.
That's not very technical, but. It's beautiful. It's like beautiful art. It really is, and yet it's science.
Yep.
It's both, and we like to play up that connection wherever possible.
Great. So as we said, we did a talk down at the Goddard Space Flight Center, and let me bring up the screen here, and let's see, PowerPoint. Okay, share, and I will go into slide mode here. I think most people, if you have any questions, if you can hold them to the end, or if there's something absolutely earth-shattering, if you're muted, I think most people muted themselves. It's bottom left-hand corner of the screen. If you're muted and you need to say something, if you hold the space bar, you can unmute yourself temporarily and then ask a question. And like I said, I'm glad Kenneth is here because I'm counting on him to fix all my mistakes. And
Oh, good.
yeah, I tell you, it was really daunting to go down to NASA and give a talk to NASA people about NASA. I mean, no pressure, nothing, what can go wrong, right? So NASA and World's Fairs will start back where it all kind of began, back in Expo 58 in Brussels. Back in the days of Sputnik and various odds and ends, there was a... Okay, let's see. Hang on one second. We have somebody chatting away. So let me mute everybody here for a second. So mute all. And I am going to unmute Kenneth since he has to, again, keep me from making mistakes. Well, I guess I have to find Kenneth here. Kenneth, do you see yourself to unmute yourself?
Yeah,
okay, great. Thank you. So big World's Fairs. First World's Fair held after World War II, and Brussels and Europe are trying to put themselves back on the map. And this was, of course, the days of the Cold War going on. So you had a massive pavilion from the Soviet Union. They went way out of their way that they would bring in the latest and greatest of their stuff to show you what was inside. So lots of industrial displays, how great they were. They also had a wonderful space display of, their current stuff that was up there, current things that were coming, very high tech, very well received exhibit. So the United States, of course, could not let that go unchallenged. They built an equally massive pavilion, the United States Pavilion, and they spent all their money on the building and realized that they didn't have much in the way of displays. So instead of having anything there, rockets or our progress in outer space, we had women's fashion shows, things along that line. So it was not a particularly impressive thing. They had a whole opportunity that NASA could have been there, and they blew it. Luckily, in 1962, they sort of started fixing it. The 62 Seattle World's Fair was the first one in the United States since 1939. And Kenneth, anytime that you want to jump in, go ahead or wave, and I'll look for you, and I'll try to give you a place in there edgewise. So NASA came out to display at the 62 fair, and they had a very well-received exhibit. For the folks that are Disney fans, they had a costume character. He walked around the outside trying to lure people in. Inside, they had a globe of all the satellites that have been put up into space or in orbit at that point in time, which if you look at it today, for 1962 is pretty impressive, the number that were up there. Today, if you can only imagine what the thing would look like, you'd probably have a hard time seeing the globe through all the orbit rings.
Yeah, particularly now with the Starlink satellites going up from SpaceX. It's going to look like a blanket around the planet.
Yeah. It must make getting out of the planet into outer space that much more challenging to find a path through it all. They also decided that they would have a mock-up of the Mercury capsule, which is on the left, and that led to an interesting situation. John Glenn does his flight. His actual capsule comes down, is recovered. NASA brings it back to the United States, and it's on its way to the Smithsonian. So the fellow who is the manager of the NASA exhibit at the fair decides he wants to have that capsule at his pavilion instead of this mock-up. So folks that work at NASA or any government facility today may get a kick out of this, but he took his crew, they drove out to the Air Force Base where the capsule had come in at, showed their NASA IDs and said, "Hi, we're here to pick up the Mercury capsule." and they were able to talk their way into it, hooked up the trailer to a truck and drove away with the Mercury capsule. Middle of the night, drove it to the World's Fair, put it on display, and the next day, the shit hit the fan when NASA headquarters was trying to figure out where their space capsule had gone. And now the guy who had put it in the pavilion said, well, you can get it back if you want, but it's sure not going to look good in the newspapers now, is it? So the one on the right is the actual space capsule that had been flown, and people were out taking a look at it. So it's hard to imagine today. And Kenneth, you said years ago people were still borrowing things very easily to go get them repaired or refurbished.
Yeah, it was. It's astonishing how fast and loose things were back in the early '60s. When I first got to Goddard, I talked to an engineer who'd been there at the time, and he said they had a problem with a spacecraft they were about to launch. It needed a part replaced, and they decided that the fastest way to do it was to take the actual experiment, load it in the back of his station wagon, drive right out of the Goddard gate with nobody questioning him, go down Interstate 95 to, I don't know, like Carolina or something, meet the vendor who was coming up from Florida. They switched the part in the parking lot, drove back to Goddard, drove it in with no questions with this multi-million-dollar spacecraft going in and out of Goddard in his station wagon. I thought, oh my Lord, you know, you wouldn't get 10 feet to either side of the gate nowadays with that. So things have changed.
Yeah, they had never heard of the phrase clean room.
That's a good question as to what they did. I guess they didn't need it for whatever they were doing.
Well, yeah, today I would not expect anybody to have much luck just showing up with a truck and NASA badge and say, I'd like to take one of those with me. So they also had displays of spacesuits, models, that sort of thing. But one of the things they didn't have for a while was any astronauts. The press really got upset when Russia brought some of their cosmonauts over and they took a tour of the fair, got into all the papers and said, why on earth, you know, are the Russians here, but the Americans can't be bothered? So in an emergency move, they flew John Glenn out. He's seen here talking to Dr. Werner von Braun. They flew him out, Dr. von Braun, and a number of others. Here's Dr. von Braun getting ready for a panel. Albert Fisher was there with us last week, was talking about how they lined up, they couldn't get all the astronauts because a bunch of them were actually doing things like flight training, stuff like that. But they had some of the future astronaut corps, and he got a kick out of meeting, as he said, a very unpretentious, unknown test pilot who everybody was totally ignoring because they wanted to talk to John Glenn, and that test pilot was the first man to walk on the moon, Neil Armstrong. So real quick anecdote there. Hang on 1 second here. I have to go up here 1 second. Sorry, we have somebody that is going away. Okay, we are sorry for the interruptions there. So we jump forward now to the 1964 World's Fair. They had a very disappointing display. Like I said, none in 58. This is sort of disappointing in 62, but NASA really made up for it in 1964. This is the space display of space displays. So for folks that are not familiar with it, the 64 World's Fair was held on the same site in New York as the 1939 World's Fair. Massive endeavor. Up at the top is Shea Stadium, which has been replaced by Citi Field now, but just a kind of general view of it. If you still go to Queens today, the Unisphere, the theme structure, symbol of the fair, is still in the park. And the theme of the fair was peace through understanding. So NASA's plans fit well into that they were talking about the peaceful uses of outer space. When I worked, at Cape, I was blowing things up for nuclear missiles and stuff. NASA, of course, was going the peaceful side of things. And for folks that are familiar with it, you have the New York State Pavilion, which is famous to all the space fans as the spaceships for Men in Black. So NASA decided we're going to be at the fair. The government wanted to have it big there, and they were going to display in the Texas NASA Pavilion. You can see artist mock-up here. It was a pretty low-key activity. You'd walk up the spiraling ramp, look down at a mock-up of a Mercury capsule, and in the building behind have a couple displays. Luckily, there were two thoughts. One was that building a building with displays was fairly expensive. Second, it wasn't very exciting, so they decided that they would come up with something different, and that was the United States Space Park. And you can see it's presented by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and the Department of Defense. So it's here on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. The Hall of Science is under construction, opened very late in the 1964 season, but there's an overview there of Space Park over on the left. So if we came in the Peter Stuyvesant Gate, I believe it was, one of the very first things you came to was the Space Park. Oh, is everybody seeing a blank screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute, coming up.
No, hang on a second. Sometimes it does this. And we can go back and try to figure out why.
It's there now.
Okay. So let's go back to slideshow mode. Hopefully we don't have to go, okay. So anyway, this is the view you see before you've even gotten into the ferry gate. You see these great exciting rockets waiting to bring you in. And what was interesting was a lot of these were actual rockets. They weren't just mock-ups. They had pulled equipment, in many cases flight-ready material, brought it out to the field. So here you had an actual working Titan II missile. It's a Gemini capsule mock-up on top because they had not finished the real Gemini capsules at the time. Down below you have the first stage of the Saturn V. But as this mentions here, it's an actual Titan II launch vehicle. You know, this was really exciting stuff. As a 12-year-old to go to the fair, we had, you know, watched obviously John Glenn go into orbit and Alan Shepard before him, but to actually walk up and be able to put your hand on a rocket that could go into outer space was just, it was phenomenal. I mean, seeing it on TV was one thing. To walk up to it and touch it was just, it was mind-boggling.
Well, it gives you a sense of scale too, which is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, hi. Hey, Doug, thanks for joining
That sounds
us.
like Doug Drexler.
Yes.
It is.
It is. Hey, Doug.
Welcome.
Hi,
Well,
Bill.
hey,
Hi,
well,
Ken.
We'll be getting
Hi,
to the Doug
Mitch.
Drexler section of this and embarrass the hell out of him. So.
Yeah, he must be here to make sure we don't misstate him at all, misrepresent him.
Oh,
one
he's
thing-
going to be disappointed then.
One thing I was going to mention here, Bill.
He is the man. He is the top guy, top most in the universe.
Excuse me, my head's swelling here. The headphones keep it on.
Mutual
Kenneth.
Admiration Society.
You can't swell too much.
So,
One thing I
Kenneth,
wanted to mention on this Titan slide, you mentioned earlier, Bill, about the peace through understanding and NASA trying to emphasize the peaceful use of outer space. I believe these Titan rockets were repurposed intercontinental ballistic missiles.
yes,
This is
absolutely.
really taking a military purpose and turning it into civilian use to great effect. The Titans were workhorses for NASA for many years.
Oh yeah, back even when I worked down there, they were still having them Titans going off. So yeah, everything, people don't realize when Alan Shepard, John Glenn, these guys bolt themselves onto the rocket and off they go. They're flying on top of basically an ICBM, designed for a totally different purpose. So it was really funny when I worked at the Cape. It was a cartoon that I've lost over the years, but it was two guys sitting in a Gemini capsule. And the countdown's 5, 4, 3, and the one guy saying to the other guy, it just dawned on me, this thing was built by the lowest bidder. You think about these guys. Oh, we designed a missile to go up, not too far, come down to kill everybody on the other side. How would you like a ride? I mean, fascinating times.
The Gemini was always my all-time favorite because it was like a sports car. There were 2 seats with the gull wings.
With a T-top.
Yeah, and it even had like red pinstriping on it, like the Batmobile.
Yeah. Good stuff.
And you can, by the way, you can go to a Titan Missile Museum, ICBM Museum, just south of Tucson if you want to see it in its original context.
Yep.
It's also, as Doug will tell you, where they filmed some of the scenes for the Star Trek movie that went back to the first warp drive ship. They actually used that silo.
They did.
Right.
What was funny was that, you get a lot of fans who want to tell you made a mistake. And I ran into one guy and we were talking about that scene. He said, "You guys really blew it. You know, you had rivets on an ICBM that would never." And, and the truth is that was the missile that was in the silo. That was the real thing. So, sorry.
Hey, everybody's an expert now with the internet,
I
right?
know.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Another rocket there was this Thor Delta rocket, and Kenneth has a little surprise coming up for us later on about the Thor. So Kenneth, make sure you mention what we found out about this.
Will do.
Okay, another blank slide. I don't know why it's doing that. Hang on 1 second. No, I do not want to do that, so hang on.
Okay, see it now.
All right, so if everybody would join me and say hi to Bill Gates, you know.
We'll drag you into the iMac universe eventually.
Oh God! Hey, I brought the first Macs into Warner Brothers. I was a fan of them. So, anyway, again on this left side, again the Mercury Atlas, another ICBM with humans bolted on top of it. It's interesting. People didn't realize at the day of the fair that the spacecraft on top of this was actually the first Mercury flown. It was launched in a beach abort test, 1960. It flew for an amazing minute and 16 seconds. But at the fair, it was just up there with pigeons sitting on top of it. Sat there for years, and then we'll be talking a little while how these rockets all started rotting away. They took the rocket down to refurbish it, and when they were, much to their amazement, they found out that it was a real Mercury capsule that had been sitting there for 40-something years.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So the real capsule is now inside the museum, and the one that's outside is a replica. But this was
my God, that's mind blowing.
Yeah, it is. Amazing. How do you think we lost track of it? Where did that first Mercury capsule launch go? I don't know. It's around here somewhere.
Yeah, I misplaced it.
Yeah.
Anybody see my capsule?
So they also would bring in capsules, and I got a real kick out of this. Again, sitting out there in the sun, it's on a really wheeled display case that you would think these days, my God, you know, again, a pickup truck, a trailer, off you would go. But I've got so many pictures of people leaning on this thing, looking in the windows. You know, there's no plastic cover on it other than up at the very top. And again, one at the bottom for the heat shield, but people leaning on it and looking inside. And, you know, today when you're in any sort of museum, touching anything, stay away from it. Here, it's, you know, just come in and take your time and go and see it. They also decided that, hey, every kid would want to be an astronaut. So they put together a little photo booth. I mean, I love this kid's simulating the G-force or whatever it is he's going. It was a real crude mock-up, but it was a real success. So the next year they brought in another one with the launch tower, the escape tower, the retro rocket pack on the back. And again, you could come in, get your pictures taken, sitting in a Mercury capsule. So
was that heat shield? I don't know if that's the heat shield or a cover that comes off. Was it really red like that?
Yeah, it was.
It really was.
Yep.
Sharp.
Yep. Had to match the escape tower. Okay, back to mock-up. This was a real early mock-up before anybody had ever seen it. Come on. I have no idea why it's doing this, and I am so sorry that it is.
Because the machines say they want to help us, but what they want is to conquer the world.
Yeah, we're doing an early preview here of Skynet, so we will go back to slide
mode. Gemini
mode.
is just fantastic looking. What a beautiful, beautiful spaceship.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to go and do it another way so that hopefully this doesn't blow it. So you'll get to see more of the screen and everything. Yeah, it was really amazing. Again, we had, you know, had a few of the Mercury launches under a belt, but NASA's going away. They're working on the mock-up of the Gemini. They actually at one point brought in the real Gemini 4 that you could look inside and see what the thing looked like. Come on. And they were talking about Apollo. Again, the Hall of Science is going up in the back, but Apollo has not come anywhere near to fruition, but they had a nice size display on it. Some of the space fans always point out you can tell how early this was because of the hatch design, the
Still around.
circular hatch on it. But they had the command module, the service module, the lunar module, and people get a kick out of this. Between the seasons of the fair, they had to go and mothball it. So you can imagine folks from NASA that are used to working down at Cape Kennedy and the heat and humidity and everything else being told you have to go up and preserve your stuff for the winter to get it through. They also had the Saturn V boat tail, the first stage. It was real interesting. There was a button. They have these kind of orange pylons down holding it up. There was actually a button there and it said launch on it. And when you walked underneath it and pushed it, the lights would light up in the engines, but there was also the simulated roar of a rocket. And I can remember my brother scaring my brother Jim scaring one of my other brothers by saying, "Hey, look at this, push it. This thing starts, the sounds come on, the lights go on." My brother's convinced we're all going to be, toasted underneath this thing. But
it just sticks in your hot dogs.
Yeah. So pretty impressive when you stand under that, though, and you look at the size of the people at the base of it. They really give you an idea of just how big this thing was. And again, it's very, very small part of a full Saturn V stack. They also had things like the X-15. One of the things that I found impressive was that as they made improvements to the real X-15, they would come out here and retrofit them onto the mock-up at the fair.
Wow.
So they came up with new tanks. They came up with some new fairings. They would come out and actually put it there. And they would even change the stencils on it to match how they had changed the ones on the actual ones in flight. So they spared no time or effort to try to make this thing important. They also had amazing displays of satellites. Again, Kenneth, if you have any observations on any of these at any point, just jump in. But in some cases, they were builders, concept models. Other times, they were engineering models that they had made to make sure that they would actually fit within the shroud to be launched, that sort of thing. So they had a whole combination of this stuff, but it was very, very accurate in terms of it wasn't just some vacuum formed model. It was real metal and real, pieces of space type hardware.
And this is a real piece of history there in Mariner 4. Just because it was one of the most comprehensive early successes of the NASA program to go visit Mars and image. They weren't as sophisticated as to go into orbit or to put a lander down on the surface, but they took photos as they approached the surface and eventually crashed into it. We got some really, really nice, gorgeous photography out of Mariner 4.
Okay. Oh, Don Lancaster's father worked in the Mariner project. Oh, that's pretty neat.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it was amazing stuff. I mean, when you see it, it's like I said, you can walk right up to it and touch it, and they didn't stop you. This fella here is looking very bored. He's wearing, it might even be Mitch's patch that he's got on his shirt today. But this was right when Ranger was landing on the moon. They were doing the surveys of potential landing sites for the Apollo missions, and the day of the landing they put this display out there. They have a little thing, it's sort of like in a mall. You are here. No, Ranger is there. And they would come and do press conferences out at the fair to try to promote NASA's successes during the 2 years of what was going on out there. They had all these display boards all around the fair, and when the fair ended, they just left them there, amazingly, just sitting in place. But they would exploring the moon, how we're doing that, how we're doing it with aerial observation, landing on the moon, taking things. They were trying to disprove the rumor that the moon was such a dusty area that if you landed on it, you'd sink out of sight. Therefore, we could never land on it. I found this kind of fascinating, a display difference of the spacecraft, just the size differences between what was up there now, the Mercury craft, and what we were planning on putting up there to launch up with the Apollo stuff. Telstar was a huge thing back in '64, and it's really hard for people to think about today with global geostationary satellites and everything. But Telstar, when it first was launched, would just orbit and orbit and orbit, and would come overhead for about a 12-minute window, and you had to book your time to send something up and have it send something down before it went back out of range. But Telstar was a big thing at that time, because now for the first time you can make transatlantic phone calls over this thing. You could send video over it. It was a real impressive thing. Weather satellites were big. Again, things that now people take for granted, solar cells on top of your houses. Well, the solar cells on top of the Tyros was the first time most people had ever heard of a solar cell. Here, Nimbus weather satellite. Again, we take so many things for granted today. You know, I get a kick out of here, people grousing that, oh, they said it was only a 27% chance of rain. You know, back in 1964, it may rain, it may not. My dad used to joke about the weatherman. You know, whether you got it right or not, it didn't matter. The weather was going to do what it was going to do. But now we had actually satellites that were up there orbiting. And again, they brought in this is not as intricate as some of the others, but they brought in actual engineering, studies of these things. This is one I got a kick out of. Here's the space shuttle, 2 kids standing in front of it. And this was what NASA was touting as a space shuttle. It was not the space shuttle that we got to know, which would be launched from the Cape, go up, come back down. This was a shuttle that would shuttle you between parts of the space station we were going to build. So
That's almost like a bottle suit.
I was just going to say exactly that, Doug. If you go back to the old Disney shows, they had these things they called bottle suits, because they would sit into a spaceship, they would launch out, they'd fly around, the guy would be maneuvering remote arms and everything, build this thing, and then he'd come back and he'd land again. And it's exactly what this is. You have these robotic arms, the guy would sit in here, and if you go to Star Trek, you know, the motion picture and that sort of thing, they're building the Enterprise, they're getting ready to go out into space, and there's guys flying these little worker bees all around there. Yeah. So they call it the space shuttle, you know, and again, so many things you predict and you look at from 1964 are the sort of things, you know, now that people take for granted, you know, guys jumping in a little robotic thing and building spaceships. Here's another one that never, luckily, came to be a big one. As a matter of fact, I mentioned this on a space board about how I was happy that nuclear engines were not being used big time in rocket propulsion, because unfortunately things do blow up on the pad. They do blow up shortly after liftoff. And having worked on nuclear missiles, I was not a fan of sending nuclear-powered engines up into space, because if they blow, it's going to be real messy. But back at this point in time, they had high hopes for NERVA engines being the things that would be powerful enough to be able to launch us out on things like MARB probes, things like that. They also pointed out how the fact that NASA was in the business of putting up satellites for other folks. So you had Ariel, the first satellite that went up for the United Kingdom. They built it, NASA launched it. You had Alouette, the first Canadian satellite, again, put up there, covered in solar panels. And they also decided to go on the people aspect of this. So they had taken a page out of Seattle's World's Fair by not having astronauts there, and they brought in a steady stream of astronauts to the 64 World's Fair. A friend of mine actually owns this plaque now that Gordon Cooper is getting presented here. So you talk about a pretty neat World's Fair souvenir. I went out a couple times when the astronauts were, being touted that they were going to be out there, and you could not get anywhere near them. I mean, you've seen crowds. Well, in 1964, the chance to shake a hand of an astronaut or to get an autograph was just insane. It was, just crazy. So again, you didn't even have to be known. You know, here's Neil Armstrong. Who knew Neil Armstrong in 1964? Well, he was an astronaut, hadn't flown, was going to be a whole bunch of years, but everybody, oh, I want to meet an astronaut. So he's passing out all these pictures that they had brought, because the crowds are just insane out there. I mean, really good PR to have the besides all the hardware, to put the human face to it. They also started first day covers. Everything that they did out there, they would do a special cancellation. So now when Gemini 4 flies, we go do a special cancellation on that. Gordon Cooper's coming out here. Scott Carpenter's coming out here. So there's, for people that collect stamps, a big list of things you can pick up and get for your collection. They also, NASA was not the only thing at the fair with space. Matter of fact, it seemed, besides Belgian Waffles, spaceships seemed to be the #2 most popular thing at the fair. So this is the Hall of Science. You can see the sign in front for Rendezvous in Space. And they had a lifting body that would go up and meet up with a satellite. You started with a movie with Danny Thomas talking about things going up in space. But this is very much like, remember the $6 Million Man, everybody, the crash of the lifting body at the beginning, very much like it. And this was a thing done that would move across the screen. It was very interesting because it would mesh the moving lifting body and the rocket with pre-filmed sequences for a nice multimedia thing. After the fair ended, this was left in the Hall of Science for a number of years. And I believe this lifting body is in a space museum now, or a flight museum. Okay, move on. Okay, so as I said, everybody had to have a spaceship. If you were building Apollo capsules in the state of Missouri, well, of course, you put one there. You would also make sure that you had a Gemini capsule. So inside, outside the pavilion, you could see Mercury. Inside, you could see Gemini. And I think I always mispronounce it. I learned it as Gemini. How is it actually pronounced, Kenneth?
I would have said Gemini myself.
Well, you know, I always used to say Gemini as well, and then I saw a number of astronauts calling it Gemini.
Yeah, that's the way. That's the official NASA pronunciation.
It is.
And I can't get you. Yeah, I actually looked it up because I called it Gemini in a talk, and somebody called me an idiot. As you know, people like to find mistakes. And I thought, oh no, it's the right thing. I looked it up, and if you look at the phonetic pronunciation, so for all these years, NASA's had it wrong. So.
Well, you know, I pronounce it according to the name of the constellation, not according to the rockets or the capsule.
Yeah. So again, Telstar are big. You could go to the New Jersey Pavilion. They were very proud that the Telstars were designed and built by Bell Labs. So you could walk up and see a display of it there. In the back, you can see Weigh Yourself on the Moon. So again, you could walk in. They had a scale that would simulate what your weight was on the moon. Very, very popular, I imagine, with the, you know, I would say with all the ladies, but today for me, having put on a pound or two, I'd like to use the moon scale. Bell System was another big thing that had a space component. Whoops, went back. They went in, they had displays here of a new communications thing. You can see Telstar sitting in the center there, and they would just start describing how they could bounce calls and radio signals, television pictures around the world. General Motors, they went further on. Again, you could see space wheels going to be flying around, little ships like their version of the space shuttle or the bottle suits flying between them. We were going to have colonies on the moon. All this stuff was animated. The little lunar rovers would climb up. They were articulated in sections. They'd go over the mountain ranges and go around.
I lived in that pavilion. I swear.
Oh, it was wonderful, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was my #1 location, and there was so many amazing things to see everywhere. But that was plus the design of the building is so epic.
Oh yeah, we'll get to your section on that in a second. So General Motors.
Another thing to notice about the lunar scenes there, and pretty much everywhere, the surface of the moon was pictured as much more angular,
very
sharp than
Barstellian.
it really is. It's very rounded in reality compared to what we expected in the early 60s.
Yeah, also had more color.
It's true.
So General Motors, you came out and there's a space capsule sort of thing in the center here that's a display about AC Delco spark plugs, but you got to do it in the space age motif. Things that you take for granted today. You know, you look at this display, it doesn't look real exciting. It's some sort of dish, right? Well, this is the sort of thing you see on the top of almost every gas station these days where they're linking their ATM networks together. This GM was talking about how they were going to have dealerships linked together by satellite dishes so that they could have two-way communications instantly anywhere from around the world. So they were putting satellites up. If you look up at the top of the picture, you can see all these grid things. It's the idea of how everything was going to be interconnected between a web of satellites. Chrysler was amazing. You know, you said, why is there a rocket at Chrysler? Well, they were building rocket parts for the government. Everybody was building rocket parts for the government back then. So in '64, it had a kind of a low-key power paint color scheme. '65, they came back to a big time. Lots of colors. The transportation and travel area was big on space. I get a kick looking at this. If you look at the moon dome, the green dome down in the center of it, right below that is a Polaris missile. And, you know, you just never know how your life is going to go. So here's 1964. I'm looking at this Polaris missile. 9 years later, I'm working on the replacement for that, you know, very, very missile. So no idea in 64. Then I walked up. Oh yeah, a giant tire. Oh, and Doug shrunk down the giant tire, and he has it. No, it's a toy. I mean, you could walk up to these missiles and just, you know, take a whack at it, and everything was right there. But here's proof that Neil Armstrong was not the first man to walk on the moon. Two guys up there are putting the finishing touches on the moon dome, and inside they had a Cinerama film done by Douglas Trumbull on space flight, and unfortunately nobody has been able to find a copy of that film. It appears to be lost.
Now, I had read that Stanley Kubrick saw that film,
Yes.
and that's how he got connected to Trumbull.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly how it came to be. You know, amazing that you walk out there, you see the movie, and then, you know, X number of years later, you're making 2001: Space Odyssey. United States Pavilion, huge pavilion, was a lot about the history of the United States, but you got on these moving side bandstands that went around, sort of like the stands at Disney's Energy Pavilion, going out, and then on the way you would pass things. And again, they had a Mariner 1. The narrator would give you a real brief talk about what you were going to see as you went through. And Mariner 1 is going to take us into new reaches of space, that sort of thing. But the fair comes to an end. You can see everything being torn down behind it. The Hall of Science was still there. The rockets were there. And as I said, they took some of the stuff out. The X-15 went off to another NASA facility, but these rockets were always intended to be there full time. So they were left behind. So by 1987, when I took this, the space park was in pretty sad shape. It was falling apart. This is the basis of one of the rocket engines that used to light up and roar. Now it was absolutely full of pigeons, and just it was just in a real mess. And I think Kenneth has some thoughts about the space park at this point.
Yeah, well, I think you have one more slide maybe to show first.
Oh yes,
87.
right, yeah.
And then from here, in a good example of starting with lemon and making lemonade, as they say, in the fall of 2013, the government went through one of its periodic shutdowns. And unlike now where we're working from home, I was told to go home and don't work. It's illegal to work. Government's not funded. So for a while I was idealistic and did things around the house and whatever. And then finally decided, I'm going to do something exciting during this break. So I decided to take a trip up to Flushing Meadows Corona Park, where the fair was held, and went there map in hand from the fair and literally walked the entire park and found out where everything was. But as part of that, I did actually visit the current day Rocket Park, which I'm glad to say looks much nicer than it did in 1987 and succeeding years. They've
Finally
haven't replenished the whole thing, but they've gone through and fixed things up very nicely. So you see here the spaceship on the left with the rocket on the left with the tower is the Mercury Atlas D, and on the right is the Titan II Gemini, looking sparkling clean and very nice. And they've also, as you saw in the previous slide, they've fixed up a lot of the signs reproducing the signs that were there during the fair and explaining the history of the space park. So that's kind of fun. Those are all still there, so you can go there nowadays and look at it. You'll notice in these pictures that we've got the Titan and the Atlas, but we don't have that Thor Delta rocket that Bill pointed out earlier. Well, so, one says, well, where did it go? Well, here it is. And it turns out it's sitting in my backyard at Goddard at the visitor center.
Wow.
But I did not know that rocket was from the fair until Bill came out to do his talk, and we started chatting about it. And he told me a wonderful story about how he was asked, I guess, years ago to give some information to the visitor center, and they made a little plaque up about it. And that's basically all they know about it. And years later, I guess he went back to try to find more about it, and he asked them, for more information. They said, well, we don't really know, but you should talk to this guy named Bill Goddard. He'll tell you everything about it.
Yeah, it was really funny. I give this talk at NASA, which is again intimidating to have all these people to design stuff you can only dream about. And I get to the point, does anybody know where the Thor rocket went? And people are sitting there, and I said, it's out in the visitor center. I show the picture. Literally half the audience starts getting up to go run outside the building to look at the Thor. Either that or just to get away from me. But I said, no. You see
Well, it
every
was a good
day,
excuse.
every night. Yeah, sit down, shut up. We're going to watch the rest of it. So people like afterwards coming to us, I've worked here for 30 years. I never knew that was that rocket. I said, did you ever walk over to it? No, I just drive by it every day. So,
Wow.
but it was actually interesting. And again, Kenneth and I, we met because of the NASA and the World's Fair a bit. The next part, we have Doug Drexler, who would like to embarrass Doug here. Doug is another World's Fair aficionado that has had a career that is just, the thing of storybooks. So I was going to embarrass Doug, but
I can't be embarrassed. Are you kidding?
oh, you should have heard
Look
what we
what
said
I
about
wore.
that NASA. Yeah.
In tight.
The trouble is, Doug, you could still fit in the damn things.
I can. I've been very careful.
Yeah.
Just in case I have to go to outer space. They might
Hey.
call me at any moment.
Well,
No.
Doug is a real Star Trek fan, and proof of it. What is your home gym called?
The damn it, Jim. Or he's dead, Jim. Right?
Yeah. So Doug worked on a variety of shows, and including Star Trek, and I was able to get some pictures of his Star Trek influence, the World's Fair influence on Star Trek that we put into the NASA exhibit, which is well received. So, Doug, you'd like to give us some chats on it?
Well, Gary Hutzel, the visual effects supervisor, I was in the art department at the time. I worked in a lot of different departments. At the time, I was in the art department. And Gary Hutzel was a visual effects soup, and he had no money. They were still making things physically. And he says, I have to shoot this thing the day after tomorrow. And the center section of the building is actually the water reclamation plant out in the Sepulveda Basin in the San Fernando Valley here. And it's really beautiful. I mean, if you're ever out here, you could visit Starfleet. It's just gorgeous. And he wanted to add a building extension to it. And I look, of course, you look at it now, and to my eye, it's very primitive. But we had like a day that the sail, which was based on the General Motors Pavilion, was made from level or blinds. And the tube in the front, which a little tram would go through, was a CD rack. That was a CD rack, and a bird feeder went through it. Now, recently, I don't know if Bill has this, but recently in the Star Trek Ships in the Line calendar, I went back and with CG redid this shot and made it look exactly like the General Motors sail, which is so elegant looking, so beautiful. So the World's Fair has, see there? This was from the director's cut of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. I put foreground buildings here, and there's the New York State Pavilion. You could see the Johnson, Travelers Insurance umbrella. You could see a little bit of the Ford Pavilion. I stuck World's Fair stuff into Star Trek every opportunity that I had. And that's another one. Oh, the other thing that we did, go back to that one for a second.
Sure.
The other thing that we did is, if you watch the current Star Treks, the new ones that J.J. Abrams has done, and they go to San Francisco, it's just like congested buildings, and Roddenberry always felt that a lot of the city areas would be returned to parkland. So Mike Okuda and I went in and painted out almost all of the buildings, and we just kept the central area with buildings and returning it back to parkland.
If only. Now, again, you were following great footsteps, as far as, way back in the 60s, Albert Whitlock.
Albert Whitlock, I mean, he's one of the greatest matte painters ever, and he did this for a Star Trek episode. I think it was first seen in Court Martial. It was Starbase 11. And there they are, plain as day. You've got the New York State Towers, and you've got a little building there that almost looks like the Travelers. And next to it, I was always like, when I saw that, I was so impressed. Here we are in a crater on another planet, and there's a building that looks just like a regular skyscraper. And I always found that, to me, that said that they were so comfortable with what they were doing it didn't have to look like a can that people lived in. It was a building with big windows. Yeah, yes, I did that for a Star Trek book. The interesting thing about that office building thing was that when I was on Battlestar Galactica and we were doing visual effects for Galactica, our office was in the Hitchcock building, and particularly our offices were the offices that Albert Whitlock worked out of.
Oh,
In
wow.
the 60s. And one night I went around the corner, and it was probably a pretty big skyscraper at the time it was built, but there's a black building out in front, and it is that building exactly. And I'm like, oh my God, that's what Albert Whitlock used for reference for this.
Yeah, that's called the Black Tower. Oh,
Yeah.
somebody's got us on echo there. It's the Black Tower, and I worked at Universal, same sort of thing. People, it's like science. It's something out of like a movie. People say you need to come to a meeting in the Black Tower.
You're right.
Yeah, you expect to see dragons or wizards or something. But
Did you ever hear what Harlan Ellison said about that?
no.
Well, Ellison was always at odds with every movie studio, and he was always fighting with somebody, which is what was so much fun about him. And he said, in 2001, where the apes touched that black monolith, that black tower, and it would give them intelligence. Well, at Universal, they have this black monolith of a building that when they touch it, it reduces their intelligence.
That's funny. Well, we'll move on from the 64 fair. Again, big success.
And maybe, Bill, one quick thing to interject there. I wanted to say Doug's whole experience here of being inspired by the World's Fair and going on to make a career basically based on the ideas and the inspiration you got there is something which should be recognized in general. It inspired so many of us, and we all went off in different directions, but I can't tell you how many folks at NASA have also been inspired by stuff they saw there, at least the older folks, to go ahead and go into science and technology. So there's value in these big exhibitions far beyond what you get.
Oh yeah, I mean, I tell people all the time, I went to the fair at 12 years old, saw my first computer, was actually able to type on my first keyboard. You could go to various pavilions and you put in your birth date and would give you famous things that happened that day, or you could go to another pavilion, get a recipe for beef stroganoff or something. But the idea of actually having all this knowledge at your fingertips, I credited big time on how I went into the technology field.
One of the things about the fair that was an epiphany for me was I think that was the first time, I was 11. I think that was the first time I had the thought that somebody is making this stuff. Somebody is doing this as a job. There are people who actually, oh God, would I love to do that. And meanwhile, I'm going home and I'm building little model kits and stuff like that. But the fair was a huge inspiration for me to move in that direction. And storytelling. I mean, the fair is just one big storytelling, celebration. Yeah, great
stuff. Well, we jump up to Montreal in 1967. What had happened was the New York World's Fair was not a, quote, official World's Fair because Robert Moses decided he was going to do a 2-year fair. He was going to make basically every rule that you break to get your fair made an official fair, he broke. So 1967 was the next official World's Fair, and NASA still had a nice exhibit there. This is the United States Pavilion, gigantic geodesic dome. If you go inside, there was the world's longest escalator, and down below there were all sorts of displays about Americana, Hollywood, political systems, farming and everything. But you took this escalator up to the top, and you got into this massive NASA display. It was very impressive. You got all the way up there, and again, they had brought in some of the stuff that had been repurposed from the 64 fair, but others were brand new exhibits that had come into it. You had a Gemini spaceship, again, had actually flown, hanging up there from wires. By this time, NASA had gotten semi-smart that you didn't let everybody go and touch everything. So most of the displays were, out of reach, out of sight. Some of them were not. But again, just fascinating things here. This parachutes, there were actual parachutes used to help lower a Mercury Apollo capsule back down. You had weather balloons, you had all sorts of stuff, space flown hardware, mock-ups, everything that was in there. You had the Apollo Command Service module had actually been flown on a test flight, and people could, walk up to it. And I think seeing the effects of reentry on this thing, how it burned and scorched and everything, gave it a whole different set of drama than when you just see a mock-up or you see it on the films or anything. To be able to stand 5 feet away and realize this thing had been glowing cherry red, and that you had to come up with a way to keep the men inside it alive was just, to me, kind of impressive. Again, you had Surveyor. A lot of these were models with displays around it telling you what they were doing, how they were figuring in the exploration of space. But you could also touch things. I got a kick out of this. These are the Mercury astronaut couches. They've been molded for each individual astronaut because they all different heights, different weights or whatever. So when they were waiting, standing around with one of those spaceships, spacesuits on, they get kind of heavy. So they made these couches that they could sit in and mold them for how they were going to fit inside the space craft themselves. So this guy on the left, I forget whose couch that was on the left, but you see Alan Shepard's, and people have written their names on it. I mean, it's again, astonishing to think what these things were done and built and everything. And it's really nice to know that Sarah was there. I'm glad she left her mark. 1968 was a World's Fair in San Antonio called Hemisphere. I've not been able to find any information that NASA participated in that at all, which is astonishing when you consider how close it is to the Johnson Space Flight Center, that they wouldn't have to have any presence there. If there is one, it has escaped me. But Expo 70 in Osaka, they had, again, some flown space modules. Apollo 8 was an actual spacecraft. They had also done a recreation of Apollo 11. They took the two different parts of the lunar lander. They were actually space-ready pieces of hardware that NASA was using for other purposes, and took them, put them together. This was not one stack that was meant to be flown together. It came from two different Apollo configurations that they were thinking of future flights. By this point in time, it was becoming apparent that they were not going to have the full range of all the Apollo flights they had originally predicted. So they were able to pull space-ready hardware off and go stick it on display there. But the huge hit of the thing was a piece of moon rock. Brought it out there, and the lines, they've said people waiting 4 to 6 hours to be able to come and look at the moon rock. It was just an amazing thing that it was actually a thing from another world, so to speak. Hugely popular, and it was basically the hit of the United States exhibit at the fair. And for many people, they said it was the most popular single exhibit at all of Expo 70. Unfortunately, this was like the apex, the top of the NASA curve. Things started going a little downhill. In 1982, the World's Fair was, you can see there's a mock-up of the space shuttle in the back, some computer displays, but the budget just wasn't there anymore. By this point in time, NASA budgeting was being cut, and one of the things that was being slashed, unfortunately, was the outreach budget, which is a shame, because you look at the number of kids that are sitting there watching this thing and thinking that these are the future, potential scientists, the future astronauts. And I think the more we do to put things out in front of kids and interest them, and as like Kenneth and Doug were both saying, you could be a 12-year-old kid looking at this in awe, and this could become your life, so unfortunately they don't seem to think as much about it that way. They did have a nice display at the 1984 World's Fair. They had initially thought about trying to bring a space shuttle into the 82 World's Fair, and logistically they figured it was too hard. Well, in 1984, it turned out another senator had a little bit more clout, and he decided that the space shuttle was going to be at the fair. So they brought in the Orbiter Enterprise, very popular display. Again, they had this close enough that you could look at it, but you couldn't touch it. I don't know if the next picture is going to show up or not. Nope, doesn't look like it is. It's actually, I'll just go back to this one for a second. They had to take the Enterprise out about a month before the World's Fair ended, because NASA had loaned it to the World's Fair on the condition that if we needed back for anything, we're going to come and get it. So about a month before the fair ended, they actually needed it because they were getting ready to do something on another launch, and they needed to have the Enterprise to do a mock-up work on it. So I've got a whole string of pictures of them bringing a barge up, hooking up a tow bar to this thing, pushing it onto the barge and taking it away, and then the empty spot for the last couple of weeks of the fair. What was interesting, and Kenneth kind of mentioned it, when I was doing my book on this World's Fair, I said, oh, I wanted to get some pictures of the Enterprise. And I thought it'd be kind of neat to show the logistics of getting the Enterprise to or from the fair. So I wrote to NASA and said I'd like to get information on it. Same thing happened to me when I was doing my 62 book, and they said, yeah, same sort of thing. Oh, we don't have anything about World's Fairs in our collection. Go to worldsfairphotos.com. That guy has it all. Yeah, that's great. You passed me back to myself. So, but yeah, the Enterprise, again, the orbiter that's on display now, this is the one at the Smithsonian, right? The Enterprise, I think that's the one at out in.
I think that's the one they kept, right?
It's in New
Enterprise
York.
it got moved to the aircraft carrier.
Oh, in New York, the Enterprise.
The Hornet?
Intrepid.
The Intrepid.
Intrepid. Okay.
The Intrepid Science Museum. They moved Enterprise to there, and then they put I think Discovery into where Enterprise used to be in Washington.
Yeah, because I remember seeing the Enterprise there years ago. It was out at the other annex or whatever they call it. So Expo 86, they had a small display at Expo 86. This looks pretty impressive, right? Space shuttle on top of the carrier. Well, it turns out this was a two-dimensional cardboard type cutout that as you walk down the walkway here, you saw the space shuttle, but there was not an actual display of it. They did have a letter here from Ronald Reagan. It was after the Challenger explosion, honoring the astronauts that had been lost in it and restating the commitment that they would stay in space. They also had a large display about the International Space Station because, as folks know, things like the robotic arm, other pieces of the space shuttle equipment were built in Canada. So it was a big piece. Then we jump up to Expo 88 in Brisbane. As you walked down this archway, there were two astronauts hanging overhead. There was a model of a space shuttle. There was a model, I forget what satellite was hanging up there. And down below, there were some signs about NASA and outer space. But this was really, amazingly, the last NASA participation that I could find in a World's Fair in 1988. And for folks that don't know it, World's Fairs are still continuing today. So somebody said, well, how about NASA? They were at Expo 92. I mean, they brought the space shuttle, right? It's pretty bitchin' looking thing to see it there. This was actually a prop built for the Ringling Brothers Barn and Bailey Circus, where they had an act that was about space shuttle in it. It was built in Apopka, Florida by private company, full-size replica of the space shuttle, brought over to Expo 92, and then nobody knows where it's gone since. So Doug, if I don't know if we lost Doug. Oh no, there he's got all sorts of things. He's got the Lost in Space robot on the back and everything. But now, Doug, here's a quest for you. Go get the space shuttle. It's out there somewhere. I mean, it's pretty amazing that somebody would build a mock-up of it. So that really comes to the end. We'll do Q&A, but I'd like to thank folks for coming. Again, my website, worldsfairphotos.com. If you go to /Zoom, that has the schedules for each week. Next week, we'll be talking about Expo 67 in Montreal in depth. And then the following week, we're going to be doing a World's Fair show and tell. So if we can get Doug to walk in his backyard, he can show us his luminaire from the fair.
Yes, maybe I will do a remote from my backyard.
That'd be great.
I'd love to do that. That'd be fantastic.
So let me stop sharing here. I see some people are chatting. Tell me, let's see, hopefully nobody. I didn't say Grover Cleveland this week, did I? No, okay. So 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the World's Fair. It says right on it, Grover Whalen, the head of the World's Fair. And I go, oh, and Grover Cleveland at the World's Fair. I have this mental block, and it's really bad, the mental blocks you get. Like, I always mistype the word Disney. Instead of DIS, I always type DSI. I'm dyslexic that way. And when you write about Disney all the time, it's really bad. So thank God my spell checker is there to put things back in place. But it doesn't always put the words back in your mouth the right way. So appreciate folks joining. What questions could Kenneth answer for you or Doug answer for you, and I can watch?
Well, one other thing I want to mention before we go into the Q&A, we talked about Enterprise moving from the Smithsonian Museum in DC out to New York on the Intrepid and Discovery replacing it. That led to a really interesting picture. During the transfer process, there was a spot where the Enterprise shuttle came face to face with the Discovery shuttle. And then they took off.
Oh, I've seen
Enterprise
that picture.
and sent it out.
Yeah.
And the thing that's really cool, and I don't know if they did it on purpose, but season 1 of Star Trek Discovery ends with Discovery and Enterprise, the starships, face to face in an almost identical pose. It was astonishing to see that. I was like, wow.
That's neat. Yeah, I remember when they brought the shuttle out here to LA, and to get it out to the Science Center, they had to take down X number of trees and street lights. And
They made a whole film out of it.
Yeah, amazing thing of getting it out there.
There's a great meme going around now that shows, has one of those pictures of it, the shuttle going through LA, and it's underneath the title says something to the effect of, because of COVID, everything's quieted down and nature is taking over, and the space shuttle has returned to its natural habitat as it winds its way through LA.
You can actually see that video at the California Science Center. It's what they show before you go in to see the.
Yeah.
There was one picture that I saw. It was on the cover of the LA Times. And it was shocking to me how blasé to some people's the space program has become. It was when they were moving Endeavour through the streets of Los Angeles, and they were going through a residential neighborhood. Yeah. And it was a picture across 2 kids playing basketball. through the driveway, you could see the nose of the space shuttle. But the space shuttle's over here. Why are you playing basketball? It was so mind-boggling to me.
Hey, there's no money in space. There's money in basketball.
Yeah, I guess so.
Bill, can I ask a question?
No. Yes, you can. You just did.
I'm very
He's cruel.
Good, I like him cruel.
I have to be nice to her. She knows right where I live, so yes.
You got that right. I may have missed it. When I remember when that Apollo, the Challenger rather, when the explosion, in fact, I think I watched it, it was in, was it 1984? 86?
January 86.
86, yeah. And it was just unbelievable. My point was, when I saw that you showed that, it made it so much more real to me, because seeing it on television, as you say, you see something, but when you showed the picture close up, how it was burnt, where did they destroy that model, or is that somewhere in a museum that they kept for prosperity?
I think the rather burnt-looking spacecraft that Bill showed was actually an Apollo capsule that had gone through re-entry. The Challenger shuttle, I believe, is buried in a silo somewhere, aside from very small number of pieces kept out for further study. But that's as a sign of as a sign of respect. They did not want to put it up as a exhibit.
Yeah, they took a former silo that was used for ICBM testing at Cape Kennedy, and it's all the remains are buried and encapsulated there for posterity.
Could you just refresh my memory? It is a long time ago. What actually went wrong when it was going up? I mean, did they lose control? Did something happen with the rocket?
It was human error. They decided that politically they were going to launch this thing on this date, this time. And NASA, unfortunately, got into a situation where, like many things, nobody wanted to say no, because if you said no, you were the one that got your ass fired. So it was very cold that day, and you had what are called O-rings that separate pieces of the rocket from each other. And again, if any of my NASA friends fix me if I go wrong in this, but what happened was the O-rings contracted with cold. So now the missile gets launched, and these O-rings that were supposed to keep the flame from hitting the other parts of the rocket were not out in their normal configuration. So they should never, ever have launched that thing at the condition that they did. And there were people that were saying that we've never done it this cold, we've never done it this way. Shut up, we've never blown one up before. What are the odds of it happening now? And
Wow.
Basically, it was a jet of hot material coming out the side of the solid rocket boosters, which are to the side of the main ship, and there's a huge fuel tank in the center on which the shuttle rides, and that is basically like blowing a little blowtorch onto the side of the gas tank until it ruptured and blew up. There's an excellent book. It might be something that puts you to sleep after the first 100 pages, but there's a book out there called The Challenger Launch Decision. If you really want to see what happened and get a good understanding of it, it's actually a pretty compelling book.
Remember they had a live, the Challenger, they had a blue ribbon panel to try to figure out what went wrong. And the physicist Richard Feynman was on the panel. And they actually had this live on television. I'll never forget it. He took a glass of ice water and he took a piece of material that the O-rings were made out of and it was flexible until he put it in front of everybody, in with the ice, left it there for minutes. He took it out and showed how brittle it was and that it would break. And it was such a, if you don't know who Richard Feynman is, I highly recommend a book that won't put you to sleep from beginning to end. Oh heck! It wasn't called Oh heck, but it was.
You're joking, Mr. Feynman?
Surely you're joking.
Surely you're joking, Mr. Feynman. Get that book; you will love it because he's such a character. It's so much fun.
He's written a bunch of others, but since 2 or 3 of us actually said surely you're joking at the same time period, that's obviously the best one.
That's the one.
What was the second shuttle that was lost? What was the name of that one?
Columbia.
Yeah, the Enterprise actually was called back into service to try to figure out what happened to the Columbia. So they thought that pieces of the foam from the tank had come off and damaged it. So they actually took the Enterprise and put a air cannon and were shooting chunks of foam into it at various speeds and various distances to see what damage it would do to the wing, because they figured they could damage the Enterprise, repair it, put it back on display, but they were not going to take any of the other flight-ready spacecraft that had been, sitting there waiting to figure it out before they did a return to flight. So the Enterprise had been used, as a mock-up, for doing so much, the first, glided in landing and all that. But now they took it out and did the test with the air cannon to shoot pieces of foam at it. So amazing how things that are in display in a museum can come back into actual use at times.
Right.
Bill, there's a really good book out. There's a really good book out by Leininger called "Bringing Columbia Home," which talks about the whole incident and the recovery, and then what pieces they decided to leave out for display and what they left private for the families, and where they ensiloed all of it. I was on a judging committee for Space Books last year, and that was the one that really caught all of us because it was so well written.
I'll have to look for that. Thank you.
Yeah.
There are actually...
One more question, Bill, may I? One more question. I've noticed that they're doing this new Space Force, this new program. Is it ever going to be like NASA had it? Because you have so many private companies now going here and going there, or is it just now going to be a commercial thing?
Well, I tell you, that's the $64 billion question.
Always. Yeah, but for people who have studied NASA and the depth of NASA, do you think it can come back, is my question, to what NASA represented?
Well, NASA's not going away. The Space Force is something that's in addition to NASA. So hopefully they keep the civilian aspect of space exploration separate from the militarization of space.
She might be referring to SpaceX.
Yeah.
Well, that's Tesla. That's
there's two different things. Space Force is what Trump announces, a way to protect
I'm talking
us
about
from
Space Force.
Well, Space Force is a military arm, and as Kenneth mentioned, it's also SpaceX. That's Elon Musk, the same guy behind Tesla, and he's got the bitchin' rockets that go up and then come back down and land and get reused again, which is just phenomenal to think about.
Science fiction. I mean, there was one where they landed two simultaneously. Remember that?
Simultaneously.
That looked like a visual effect. I mean, it was just like so beyond what we're used to seeing.
Right.
But that is, however, the way we grew up when we were watching sci-fi in the
I think
50s and 60s.
Exploration, and I think maybe Ken, will agree with me that we're in a better spot than we've ever been before. Where we have private industry, putting money into it. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Richard Branson, and then you have Space Force, and then you have NASA. Back during the moon shot, it was all being done by the government, pretty much. I mean, they enlisted companies like Grumman and North American Rockwell and stuff. But now there's, with so many different things being developed, different kinds of. Richard Branson's is a space plane that goes up and flies down.
Wow.
And Elon Musk is take off and land on the tail. It's great.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that, Doug. It's an exciting time, and I think we can work with the private companies on the civilian aspects of space and get some competition going.
Hey.
And in general, maybe accomplish more.
See, that can work now.
It's amazing when you think about how they were predicting, this is from Disneyland in the 50s, but TWA, this was, again, you saw the simulation where you launched this thing up, you flew around the moon, you came back and it landed back down, and they were going to take off again within an hour to go do the next flight. So poor TWA is not with us anymore, but we finally got rockets that go up and come back down. That's amazing.
Almost became a joke in the 50s. The idea of a silver, Ray Bradbury would talk about R's for rocket, the silver rockets that would take off and land on their tail. That was a science fiction trope.
Yep.
That by the 60s, it was a joke. Oh, they're not going to be like that at all. And then to see it come back.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
It boggles the mind.
Yep.
So the children have a chance yet to have their aspirations filled. If they see all this, it becomes exciting. And you were saying before how young children, or the kids, mind you, the kids today, I'm not sure they have the same thoughts as they did years ago. If it's not on a cell phone, an immediate, I'm not sure they have the concentration to think about.
They said that about us too,
Yeah.
Oh, they do? Oh, okay. And you turned out okay, right?
Hey, we were all reading comic books. No, really, back in our generation, there was all the thing, oh my God, those kids, their heads are all stuck in comic books.
Television.
Didn't turn out too bad.
Yeah.
I built an Apollo space capsule when I was in school to take to a school science fair. So, here we are.
Yep, it's awesome.
There is good hope for the next generation.
I'm sure you'll know about it, but at the end of the month, SpaceX is launching 2 live astronauts.
Yeah.
Dragon capsule.
Yep.
And that is going to be, that's one of the I haven't had. It's going to be so thrilling. I'm going to feel like I'm back in the 6th grade watching, the Apollo missions, or when they're really putting their lives on the line there. People kind of got used to space travel. Space shuttle launches were commonplace, and many people weren't even watching them anymore.
No, matter of fact, for those of us living in here, LA, they would tell us the space shuttle was coming back. We'd hear the sonic booms from it.
Yeah, the sonic boom.
Yeah, they'd let you know it wasn't an earthquake. But it got to the point where, Doug mentioned when they first went off in school, they would put a TV in the hallway and we would all line up to watch the thing go up. A couple of years later, they're up in, space again, and it wasn't even on the news. They didn't even cover the launch. They only covered it when things blew up. But, people took it very much status quo. But I guess it's the same sort of thing. When the Wright brothers flew, that was big deal. Now today, nobody goes off to the airport and goes, "Oh my God, look at that!"
Yeah, it's normal. It's normal.
Yeah.
Wasn't it Elon Musk that said he wanted to have suborbitals so we could have dinner in Los Angeles and then fly over to Asia and have, cocktails afterwards? It'd be only a few hours, maybe a 25 or 30-minute suborbital or something.
Yeah, it could still happen.
I wish. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those 14-hour flights over there are long.
Hey, today I just like to be able to go down the street and eat at McDonald's.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that.
To
Yeah.
me, that's oh my God, that's, you know,
Yeah.
to the moon.
Well, I have to leave the meeting. Bill, I want to thank you so much, and to all of you, your insights. I was completely ignorant as to what it was all about, and I found it so enthralling and interesting. And I want to thank all of you who participated. Thank you. So
Well, thank you, Pamela.
Thank you.
We'll see you.
Okay.
Thank
Very
you
nice
so
to meet
much.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, we were talking earlier about inspiration. You know, we all get to the point, what are you going to do with your life? And I was trying to figure out where to go to college, what I was going to do. And I had been accepted to various schools. And my Boy Scout advisor said, why don't you consider my college? And he had worked at Grumman on the Lunar Lander project. And he had taken us out there, shown us this. And, you know, it was like, you know, gave us a piece of metal he could hold. And it was just a piece of metal. It hadn't been machined yet. And he goes, well, when this is done, it's going to go in a spaceship. It's going to go to the moon. And you go, I'm holding something that is going to go to the moon. And I thought, man, if this guy could get a job at this place, sending things to the moon, I went off, interviewed at his college, and that's where I ended up going. And it's that sort of thing that makes a whole different change in your life, that somebody just comes and evangelizes some of this stuff. But to think, my God, this is going to the moon, you know, that it was really a big moment for me.
I was born in Queens, but my parents moved out to Long Island for a while, around Center Reach, Port Jefferson area. And Grumman was in Bethpage.
Yep.
And the school took us on a field trip to Grumman. And they took us through this huge room where it was like 4 or 5 lunar modules in different, you know, stages of completion. Wow, I'll never forget that. And I still think back on that, and it blows my mind.
Yeah,
There's an excellent scene in From the Earth to the Moon, the HBO, I think it's a 12-part series on the Apollo program, or Getting to the Moon. And there's a scene there that they're always talking about the difficulty of doing the lander on the timescale they got. And the manager at Grumman, in this at least, whenever he gets really frustrated, he goes out into the parking lot and hits tennis balls against the side of his office building until he overshoots and it lands on the roof, and then he goes back inside. And at
Tennis
the very
balls
end,
you pay for yourself.
Yes, at the very end of that episode, after they've accomplished their mission, they do one of these pullbacks from his face and out the office window and up, and you look back at the roof, and it is covered with tennis balls. How many times?
If you've never seen Tom Hanks's Earth to the Moon, it is a must see. It is just so wonderful. You love it. If you haven't seen it, please, everyone's got time to watch a movie. So,
and it's full of things like that.
Yeah.
New ways of visualizing the story that you haven't actually seen 20 times already.
Actually, there were 2 things that got me. The first one was Sputnik when I was only 4. I have 3 things actually. And then my dad used to work at Ball Aerospace before it was Ball Aerospace, and he would bring home these posters of these futuristic looking spacecraft, which then turned out to be the orbiting solar observatories. And then one time he brought home just this little piece of equipment that they said was going to go up into space, and they could still bring that stuff home. I mean, they could show it to the kids. He brought it to school and showed it to us, and that was pretty much all it took for me to get interested.
that's
Pretty
fantastic.
neat. Hey, Mitch, I don't know if you saw, but Doug was showing his bird. Now, your bird's name Beaky, is it, Doug?
Yeah, Beaky Boy.
Yeah. So
Hey.
great minds think alike.
36 years. 36 years.
Will the 2 birds talk to each other?
I don't know.
This is Oliver. He doesn't talk to anybody, and he's 16 and has no feathers.
I got a cat around here somewhere. Maybe I can get her interested.
Hey, this bird has lived through many, many cats, knows just how to handle them. It's really funny to watch.
Well, I got a real kick when I went over to Doug's house meeting Beaky, and Doug and I share a whole bunch of likes, B-17s and all sorts of things. So you walk in his house and he's got, model of this, model of that, and
I got
real neat stuff. And of course, a whole row of Emmys and an Oscar and stuff that I don't have, so.
Yeah, I want to show you something else from the space park. This is what they gave these out, I suppose. Let's see. If you can read that.
Wow.
Can you read that?
Wow, cool.
I don't know if you can read that.
No, maybe next week or 2 weeks when we do the show and tell, you could take a shot of it and share it.
I got better things to show you than that. Bigger things. But this says from the Department of Defense and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
Yeah,
So-
because again, remember those rockets, the real ones had to come from DOD.
Yep.
So
Yeah, it's interesting. It's from DOD.
fun stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, it's too bad that NASA isn't doing more of this today, but, with the budgets and everything else, and so much of it was SpaceX. And, Carol and I were driving back from Pasadena one night, and we saw, these huge, weird entrails up in the sky. Remember that night, Carol? And what on earth is that? Well, it's SpaceX, shooting something.
Yes, I
out
was
of,
needed.
yeah, they were shooting something out of Vandenberg. And, again, amazing that private industry is able to do so much with it all these days. And what a lot of people probably don't realize is how much of the Cape has been run by private industry for so many years now.
A long time. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's so much of it's been privatized. So,
the pad that they land those rockets. Someone was talking about the two rocket landing.
Mhm.
It was a few years ago. That's Launch Complex 12. That is the complex where my father worked to launch.
Wow.
Wow.
I've actually been trying to get a plaque put there because there's no recognition of the Mariner 2 program, and that was the first interplanetary probe done in under a year.
Wow.
Yes, there should be. There should
Yeah.
be a plaque there.
Well, when I worked
Yeah,
at,
I've got Dad's badge here. If you can see it, that's his
Ooh.
backwards. There we go. That's his old Mariner badge.
oh, that's neat.
Cool. That's really cool.
Very
But,
neat.
yeah, I was actually going to ask a question about this. I saw the Mariner program. Most people look at the later ones. Mariner 5, I think, was the one you were showing
4,
earlier.
I think. Yeah.
And is there any recognition anywhere that you know of in any of the museums about the Mariner 2, the Venus first Venus probe? I can't find anything. It's
I
surprising.
don't know, to be honest with you. I would imagine, some museum, someplace, somewhere, but I don't know anything in particular. I've tried to track down where a bunch of these displays went after the 64 fair. And again, if you can lose an entire actual space-ready, capsule like they did, you can imagine what they lost some of the displays. But some of them have shown up in various museums. So it would be interesting to know if those ones that we were looking at, where they've ended up.
Yeah.
They got
Yeah, I imagine. Go ahead.
Pretty sure I've seen Mariner 2 models at least somewhere, but I can't tell you which museums.
Yeah, they kind of blend together after a while, don't they?
Yeah, there are a lot of programs. It's hard to keep track of them all.
Tina, you were talking about companies working for the space program. So several years ago, I wrote a book about the history of space exploration. And when I got to the commercial part, it goes back into the early parts of the 20th century. There were companies involved way back even before NASA got started. And they would buy each other and they would buy parts of each other and they would spin off parts to other companies. And then another company would spin it back off to the original buyer. It was like that biblical story of the begats, where you try to figure out who begat who. And at one point, I had to build a flow chart and an Excel spreadsheet to figure out who bought who built what, and where they are now and what they did. It's really, really complex. And it was more than just Martin and Northrop. And I mean, there were just many, many companies.
Yeah, it's interesting. Out here, LA used to be such a big thing in aerospace. And of course, almost everything is gone now. And we had a next door neighbor that worked for Lockheed at the time. And, we would talk to him about, what begat this or whatever. And he was on a lot of the stealth aircraft programs. And he used to make the old joke all the time. Oh, we did something really cool at work today. Oh, what was that? Well, I'll tell you, then I'll kill you. Okay, great. But I mean, they used to do so much stuff out here. And then you talk to people, and then they would scrap all the tooling because it was a tax write-off. And, just so much of that stuff is lost. I worked for a while at a facility in Seal Beach, California, where they had made the missiles, put them together on a giant barge, and would take them around to get them to the Cape. And they had actually built between these two sections. I got there and it was this beautiful garden full of cactus and stuff. And I'm wondering, why is this giant trench in the middle of this facility full of cactus? Well, it used to be that's where they would take the rockets from one side of the facility over to the other at Rocketdyne and move them over. And now they didn't do it anymore. So they, rather than fill in the ditch, they turn into a cactus garden. But you would talk to the people and they go, oh yeah, this used to be full of Apollo blueprints. And then we needed the space, so nobody wanted them. The Smithsonian said they didn't want them. So you know, we just put them in a dumpster, they're all gone. And you think about, wow, you know, out here we had a Apollo rocket, one of the motors out in front of Rocketdyne for years, and it's been moved now, but the company's been sold like 8 times or so, but they finally restored that about 4 or 5 years ago. But you just drive around all the time, and right on Canoga Avenue, and you look over and there's this giant Saturn V rocket engine sitting there for years and years. Now that whole facility's gone, bulldozed, torn out, you know, so much of the history is just gone.
Yeah, the first time I went out to JPL, they took a bunch of us on a tour, and we kind of went to one of the back buildings, and you look over this cliff and there's just all these bits of rocket motors and stuff laying in a trench. And now that's all buildings, but at the time it's just where they dumped everything off.
Well, we have the problem out here is Kenneth and I drove up there when he was out here in one of the times, the testing area up at the end of the San Fernando Valley. They used to test the Saturn V rockets and the big test stands, and they would light them off and you'd hear the whole valley shake and, you know, just this tremendous roar. Now, unfortunately, they found out they contaminated everything within 30 square miles of it from, you know, various runoffs and exhaust fumes and a nuclear reactor that melted down out there. But, you know, yeah, the guy that lives next to us now, the guy that moved into the Lockheed guy's house, he works at JPL. And, you know, I realize you can get a rise out of people if you ask them, you guys know the difference between meters and feet? When they made that one mistake on, you know.
Yeah, maybe not. Oh, we're so wonderfully human, aren't we?
Yeah.
We use spaceships, and we, you know, they're making the same mistakes I make when I go to work. Same, you know, these kind of mistakes.
I'll point out that was not us. That was an interplanetary craft, and Goddard doesn't work on those.
You don't want to really get started on Hubble now, do you?
No, although there's one other thing I did want to mention, since we have a lot of Disney folks, I think, on the call here as well, is that at that D23 convention that Bill mentioned, which was actually about Disney and the World's Fair, they had a conference down in Orlando, and they had some Imagineers come in and talk about the process of making attractions. And as I sat there, I was astounded that you could literally take the word attraction and replace it with space mission or space hardware, and the story is the same. Somebody comes up with a great idea, somebody designs it, comes up with this wonderful thing to do, whether it be an attraction or a space mission. You bring it to management and they say, it costs too much, de-scope it. And you go back and you make a smaller version of it, find out a way to make it cheaper.
Yeah.
And you iterate.
I'm going to use that, de-scope it. Nice.
Oh, yeah.
Very true. That is very true.
And in both cases, it can take, you know, a decade to come to fruition. And, you know, some of the space missions take even longer, but even something like the Frozen attraction at Epcot, it started out as something called the Snowball, I think, and it went through design and rescoping and then never got built. But years later, this Frozen thing was built, and you can't tell me that people didn't look at the Snowball design, because there are things in common. And, you know, that may have been 40 years in between. So it's fascinating to see how these big projects do the same thing. The only counterexample I know is when they did Small World for the World's Fair. I think they did the whole thing start to finish in 18 months. So that's still the golden example of how to do one of these big things.
It was actually
quickly.
only about 14 months. They had next to no time. And that was a tough one because the building was already being built. So it's like, come up with a bitch and show, and it's got to fit within this pre-existing, you know, confines, work around the pillars that are already being erected and stuff.
But look at everything else that they were working on at the same time.
Yep.
Carousel of Progress.
The Abraham Lincoln animatronic, which was giving them all sorts of fits.
Yeah, Ken, I have a reading list for you, because I've been reading about this from a lot of former Imagineers. Do either of you guys know Tom Morris?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he was
guy.
supposed to give a talk at a conference that I was organizing this summer, which got canceled.
Oh, he'll be
So
he's on a talk I'm doing tomorrow. I'll say hi for you. Tom and I, we started together at Disney at just about the same time, and I have lunch with him. We have an Imagineer alumni lunch every month, and Tom and I see each other and catch up. So super
you can
guy.
tell him that the immersive folks are still looking forward to hearing him.
I will tell him.
Yeah, that's great. Wow.
Yeah, you can always do it virtually too. Yeah.
We are. We're planning it for late August, we think. So.
Well, you know, you talk about how things come, you know, out of the old pile and everything, you know, or de-scoping and stuff. I was working on Epcot, and we were coming up with this thing called the Tron Arcade, where it was this immersive video game interaction thing. And we got down to the point, and they said, how much is it going to cost? And we said, this amount. And they said, you know, then it came down, can you have it open on day one? And we said, well, we think we can do our part, but we got all these other engineering subcontractors. We don't know about their part. And they said, you got to guarantee me right now you can open this on October 1st. And I said, I can't guarantee that. So it became a gift shop, right? Well, flash forward years later, one of the things we had invented for this Tron Arcade is now called Soaring over California. You know, it's like, yeah, we had it. You were in a hang glider and you were over California. You'd smell the orange groves and everything. Oh, it's really great. Bitching. Can't get it done in time. Gift shop. 10 years later, what do we come up with? Go back. Hey, this one looks good. So, you know, luckily they didn't get de-scoped. They got to build theirs. I just get to walk by every time I go to Florida and look at the thing. Oh, son of a bitch.
You know, I'm working my way through Marty Sklar's book, One Small Spark. And he talks about some of that too, not in great detail, but, you know, but basically the challenges that they faced and the solutions they had to come up with.
We had Mark Summer out to Goddard last summer, and he talked about the rides designs that he was involved in. And he talked about doing Soaring, of course, and how to convince management. He actually had to build a mechanical model out of kids' toys that were stuck in his attic to bring it in so they could physically understand how this cantilevered hang glider system would actually work, because people just couldn't visualize it at all.
Remember, didn't I send you the article about out of Visual Effects magazine about how they made the ride in Pandora, in Avatar?
I don't think so. So do send it.
I'll have to send it. It's amazing how they did that. Sorry, Doug.
Oh, no. I was just gonna, when you were talking about when you have to show someone who can't picture it, you were mentioning that From Earth to the Moon with the Spider episode with the lunar module. And they were debating over whether they needed to have seats. And they came up with the idea of, you know, their legs make great shock absorbers, they'll stand. And I guess the head of the little department there, TC or whatever, says, I don't see it. And he leaves, and the guys look at each other and they say, well, let's make them see it. And they build a cardboard model of the front of the lunar module, pretty much life size, in the office. And the supervisor comes in, TC, the next morning and walks, and he's like, what? And he looks it around, and he gets inside, and he stands there and looks through the little windows, and he goes, well, I certainly see it now. and I mean, is that the way it happened? Because it's such a great story.
I think so. I don't think there's much in Earth to the Moon that's not based on real.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Well, that's why
you can do a lot with foam core too.
Yeah, Disney and so many other companies have just built massive models of their projects because that's the only way people can visualize it. And you know, the engineers see it in their brain, but the dollar guys don't see it. So
well, I mean, one thing I learned over the years is that never, unless you have absolutely no choice, show a producer or director a work in progress, because they just can't see the finish, and they think that this is it. You know.
Now in Imagineering, there's essentially it's a holodeck that we use to visualize things. It's computer projection on all walls in 3D, and
wow,
it's more. I mean, physical models still happen, but when you're really getting in and like looking around a virtual space you're building, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of been getting into. I have a Vive. And have built some 3D environments, and we were using it to show directors' sets, you know, for episodes and shows, so that they could get an idea what it's going to be like before you build anything. And I know that automobile companies are doing the same thing now. They're having Zoom meetings like we are, but they've all got goggles, so they're all standing together as avatars, and there's a model of a car that they're working on. It's crazy.
Michael, is that like the cave? Is that like the cave that you're working in?
Yeah, it's that's it. They've got one down here in Florida too. And
yeah, because I work in planetariums at Full Dome, and sometimes we wished we had that, because it's very hard to render something, warp it, get it up on the dome. But having a cave would have been fantastic at the time.
They call it the dish. It's
Okay,
like Disney something holodeck unofficially,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's the same idea, and it's pretty neat, and it's more useful than you would think. At first, I thought, well, this is just a really cool thing, but it really is useful to be able to visualize the space and move stuff around and do whatever you need to do.
Yeah, I saw a mock-up of it at the Champaign-Urbana when they were first doing these, and people were like in the new Star Trek, you know, when they're throwing things up as I don't know, it's like a heads-up display, but they're using their hands to throw it up.
Yeah,
they were
Tony
doing
Stark
similar
in the
things.
Marvel movies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you're throwing this stuff up there on the wall. Well, in this case, in Champaign, they were using a supercomputer to power it at the time, and they were just throwing stuff up on the wall, and it was just like, oh, this is the way I imagined the future to be, and we have it now. It's pretty cool stuff.
Very cool. Yep, you have to be careful when if you visit Doug. He showed me this vibe setup that he's got, and he positioned me on the top of the rear end of a nacelle on one of the starships. And my God, does that make you dizzy?
It does.
And if you're afraid of heights, I mean, you're up there.
You're, you know that you're not really there, but your brain is saying that you are. You get such conflicting impulses when
Yeah,
in
it was astonishing.
Yeah,
and even at
really.
the time I saw it, you were just beginning to work on it. So even some of it was like wireframe and whatever, but it was still had the same effect. It's like, get me off of here.
I had done some Bonistel stuff in VR. And I also had the Proteus from Fantastic Voyage.
Oh, that's neat.
I actually put it in a room like that little, miniaturization command post, and was able to walk around the Proteus as it would shrink and expand right in front of me. Yeah, we've got too many good toys.
just like in the Tomorrowland movie, if you do that, you start crashing into his robots and walls and desks if you're not careful.
Yeah. Oh, I got.
Yeah, there's never enough good toys, Doug. Never enough.
Well, that's the thing with today's technology. Think about what you can do in your house, that you couldn't do anywhere in the world 10, 20 years ago. It's astonishing.
Well, just this meeting that we're having.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
It's really interesting because while lockdown, I don't mind being in that. It gives me an excuse to never leave the house, but we've kind of experienced one another in a whole different way that is kind of mind expanding, Crazy. Look at all you people.
I was just reading about I guess it's the third season of Discovery is still in post-production, and it's being post-produced in people's houses now. So right before all the lockdown went down, everybody was grabbing the computers and whatever they needed to be able to do post in their homes.
Yeah, it's something that you could do remotely, no problem. The only thing that you're missing, and you could live with it, is that you don't have people passing through and stopping to chat. And,
Right.
You could do Zoom meetings, but there is that all being together, that there's a certain chemistry that has an irreplaceable element to it. But yeah, you can work from home. And I found that here in LA, working on TV shows and movies, that when I was doing graphics, there were a couple of shows where I was able to work just from home, and you could just send them what they need and they look at it and they take care of, putting it in place. It's the whole manner of doing business has changed because of this. And the lockdown has caused more places to see, they're going to understand better where they could save money. Like when I was on Star Trek, like Deep Space Nine, there was like one computer in the building. And so the company would buy it for you. And then eventually they bought us all computers, but they belonged to Paramount. The way it works now is if I get hired to an art department, I provide the computer and I provide the software, and they give me like a kit rental, that, a modest kit rental. But the thing is, they don't even buy you your computers anymore. And they've learned, and just like they're going to learn from what's happening to us right now, that a lot more people, they don't need to rent office space for,
Mm-hmm.
I'm waiting to see how long it takes before I find out I'm sharing an office with Doug, even though he's in LA and I'm in Maryland.
That'd be great.
Yeah, we need to start a project here.
Well, I found that you can't
right.
you can't do everything virtually. So far, this one's escaped. Actually, I have to go in. What's that?
Soon you'll be able to wear a motion capture suit, and you send the robot out that you're connected to.
Well, years ago, when I left Disney and I was working at Warner Brothers, I was in Japan, and one of the movies we had out was RoboCop, and they sent over one of the RoboCop outfits for publicity, and being a geek, I said, this is just too much fun. So I put on the RoboCop suit in the office.
You have pictures?
Oh no, I wish I did. I just wish my staff had done it. And I kept saying, oh man, you know, I would walk up, you mentioned again, people drop in, I'd walk up behind people, some of my staff, and I say something like, we must get to work harder, you know, and they turn around and RoboCop standing there.
Dead or alive, you're coming with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
RoboCotter.
Yeah, RoboCotters. That's scary.
RoboCotter.
Well, I appreciate everybody joining, and hope it was a escape from quarantine-itis for everybody, and appreciate Kenneth's insight again. I was so fascinated, you know, doing the D23 talk years ago, and Kenneth came up and talked to me, and we've hit it off. We've been on vacation together. Well, matter of fact, Mr. Drexler, a number of years ago, he was giving a tour of the Star Trek sets in Ticonderoga, New York, and Kenneth and I are standing there, and Doug's out. I never forget, because Doug's there and he's going, oh, you guys are going to love it. It's the halls of the Enterprise, and you'll be back in 1960. That's Bill Cotter, Kenneth. Yeah. And we're standing there, hey, how you doing? So,
and then we've run into Mitch and Stephanie there as well.
Yeah.
The same
Yeah, it was fantastic.
Yeah, we had lunch with them before we went over to the tour, and then I've got pictures of me sitting on the bridge of the Enterprise with Doug and Mike Okuda. So, I mean,
those sets are amazing. I mean,
they're astonishing.
Yeah, they're complete. They're perfect, and they're lit. And I mean, me and Mike, Denise Okuda, you know, would go out like once, maybe twice a year, and just take people through and talk about, because we know everything about how they were designed. Matt Jeffries was the lead designer. You know, it really is a kind of a seminar in set designing and construction. But there people come in and they literally, I mean, some of them were, you know, 10 years old, 11 years old when the original series was on. And they were geeky kids who, that word wasn't even invented yet, who loved science fiction. And Star Trek was heaven. And when you go and you become immersed and you're in that world, there are people who literally broke down into tears. It's really moving. But yeah, if you've never been there, and when all this is over, if you're able to get out there,
you can see how amazingly accurate they were. Doug, you might appreciate this. 1977, New York.
Really? Was this at a con?
It was a con in New York at 77. Yeah, I went there.
Probably was there.
Yeah, I took my brother there, and it was this was one in LA after that.
Oh, okay. Well, I wasn't at that one.
Yeah, it was great fun. But you sit on the go to the what you call it, bridge of the Enterprise and everything today. It's astonishing. It's you'd swear you're walking through that damn show. Yeah,
it's otherworldly, really. It's an out of body experience. That's all I can say. If you love that show, if you watched it when you were a kid and it means a lot to you, it'll just blow you away. And even if you're just someone who's interested in, visual storytelling, that's what those sets are. They're for telling stories, and it's just, and also understanding the time that they were made, the kind of budgets that they had, the kind of technology that was available, the amount of time. It affects everything about how they're designed and why they look the way they looked. And that
you should do a Zoom session on it, Doug. Nobody's lived until they've seen you running down the hall.
I get a little enthusiastic. I could just jabber away. I won't. Well, maybe I'll do that sometime if we know that's going to happen, and then no one will mind.
But I've got to run. But it's nice to see everybody. Good to meet you all.
Yeah, I guess we need to wrap it up. Look at that. The recording light is still lit. I don't have to kill myself at the end of it. Well, again, appreciate everybody joining. Next Saturday, 10 a.m., Expo 67. 2 weeks from now is Show and Tell. So if you guys can put that on your calendar, we have Stephanie's got her World's Fair Bell System chair, and Mitch has one, and Doug has the Luminaire and Chrysler chairs.
Chrysler bench underneath it.
Yeah. I was out there the week you put that up, and that was talk about a kid in a candy store.
Yeah,
great stuff.
It's like it's the transporting thing to look and see that against the sky. and sit under it is just, I love it.
Well, I will now hit stop recording. Hope it all works. And again, thank everybody for coming, and hope to see some of you in a week or 2 weeks.
Thank you so much.